The boy had been singing when the world ended. Not the world as astronomers measure it. No crust buckled, no atmosphere peeled away in ribbons of fire. Just the world as James Calloway had known it. The world of pressed linen and morning tea, of prep school hymns and his father's Packard, humming through the wide avenues of the Kepler Arcology on Meridian Station. That world ended on a Tuesday in March, and it ended between one heartbeat and the next, in the space of a scream he never finished. He was 12 years old, and he had been singing Suo Gun, the old Welsh lullaby his grandmother had taught him, when the Vrethkai came through the jump corridor above Meridian and began their work. He remembered the light first. Not the light of the colony's fusion towers or the arc lamps on the agricultural rings. Something else entirely. Something that came in through the viewport above his bunk and turned the room the color of a wound. He pressed his face against the plexi and watched the debris field blossom outward from the docking spire, slow at first, like a flower opening, then very fast. Then the noise caught up with the light, and the world shook itself apart. The Vrethkai were not cruel in the way humans understood cruelty. They didn't gloat. They didn't monologue. They came in their asymmetrical ships that looked grown rather than built, organic ridges and sensor clusters arranged in patterns that seemed almost random until you realized the randomness was deliberate, a kind of camouflage for the mind. And they proceeded with the focused efficiency of a species that had been doing this for 1,100 years. They identified population centers. They disrupted communications. They separated the colonists from their infrastructure. And then they waited, with extraordinary patience, for the infrastructure to finish the job for them. James survived the first 6 hours because he was small, fast, and deeply familiar with the maintenance corridors that ran behind the residential rings. He'd explored them obsessively for the past 2 years, ever since they'd transferred to Meridian, partly because the crawl spaces were excellent for avoiding his father's disappointment, and partly because he was 11 years old, and crawl spaces were simply interesting. He had a map of them in his head so detailed that he'd drawn it out in his engineering notebook. Every ladder, every junction box, every ventilation branch that led to the observation bays. He used that map now. He lost his parents in the crush of the main concourse. One moment his mother's hand was in his, warm, slightly damp, holding tight, and the next there was a surge in the crowd moving toward the emergency transports, and her hand was simply gone. He shouted her name until his throat burned. He fought his way backward against the current until a man twice his size picked him up and carried him along without even meaning to. By the time the crowd dispersed enough for him to turn around, the transports were sealed, and the concourse was quiet, and his parents were somewhere on the other side of a sealed bulkhead door. With a Vrethkai access lock, he didn't have the code to open. He stood in the empty concourse for a long time, listening to the sounds of the station settling into its new reality. The Vrethkai security tones that had replaced the colony broadcasts, the distant thrum of their gravity anchors locking onto Meridian's core, the occasional sound of boots in the corridors above. Then he went back into the walls. He lived in the walls for 9 days. He found food in a vending machine whose power supply he cross-wired with a stripped panel cable, a trick he'd read about in an engineering magazine he kept under his mattress, and which he was now unreasonably proud to have executed successfully. He found water in the condensation traps of the climate control system. He slept in a junction room, near the agricultural ring, curled around a heating duct, listening to the Vrethkai sentries walk their patterns on the deck above and timing their intervals down to the second. He began to understand their patterns. This was the thing about James Calloway that would matter later, the thing his father had always tried to redirect toward more suitable pursuits, and which his teachers had flagged as a possible attention disorder. The boy could not turn his mind off. He lay in the dark and mapped. He counted footsteps and translated them into patrol routes. He listened to the Vrethkai communication tones. They used a form of sonar that translated through the station's metal skeleton and began to distinguish purpose from routine, urgency from maintenance. He couldn't understand the language. He could understand the rhythm of it. And rhythm, he was beginning to think, was most of what language was. On the 9th day, he was caught. 2 Vrethkai logistics workers found him in the agricultural ring, eating from a hydroponic tray with the focused desperation of a boy who hasn't had a proper meal in a week. They were smaller than the military caste he'd glimpsed through the grating above the concourse. Compact, their bioluminescent ridge markings dimmer, their movements less angular. They looked at him the way he imagined you'd look at a rat in your kitchen, with annoyance more than fear, and with the clear implication that the situation required processing. He put his hands up. He tried to look unthreatening. One of them touched the comm node at its throat and spoke. He was processed through the Vrethkai administrative system within the hour and transferred, along with 43 other surviving colonists, to the Lungua holding compound, what had once been Meridian Station's secondary cargo bay, repurposed with the unsentimental efficiency the Vrethkai brought to everything. They strung a boundary field along the inner perimeter and installed a processing station near the main lock and put a single administrator named, as near as James could transliterate it, Vetshai Nagata in charge of the whole arrangement, and that was that. James had been in the compound for 3 days when he decided it was a system. Every system had rules. Every system, if you understood its rules thoroughly enough, could be navigated. The Vrethkai weren't running a prison. They were running a logistics problem, and logistics problems had solutions. The administrator Nagata allocated rations on a productivity basis. Colonists who performed useful labor received more. The labor categories were organized by a hierarchy. James spent 2 days reverse engineering from observation, and once he understood the hierarchy, he began, carefully and methodically, to make himself useful. He was 12 years old. He could fit into spaces the adults couldn't. He understood the station's maintenance corridors in a way that even the Vrethkai, with their excellent sensors, hadn't fully mapped. And he had an encyclopedic knowledge of Earth machines, propulsion systems in particular, atmospheric and orbital both, that he'd accumulated through 5 years of obsessive reading, and that turned out to be extraordinarily relevant when the Vrethkai needed someone to explain why their confiscated human vehicles kept misfiring. "It's the fuel mixture," he told the logistics worker who'd brought him to the vehicle bay in the halting pidgin of hand gestures and borrowed technical terms they'd developed over 2 weeks of forced proximity. "The oxidizer ratio is wrong for your atmospheric blend. You're running too rich." The logistics worker's ridge markings cycled through a pattern James had come to associate with skepticism. He picked up a calibration tool from the workbench, slowly, watching the 2 guards by the door tense and then relax, and adjusted the fuel injector on the nearest atmospheric runabout. He backed away. He held up his hands again. He nodded toward the vehicle. The logistics worker started it up. It ran clean. The ridge markings cycled through something different this time. Something James had never seen before. He filed it under surprised respect and moved on. His name in the compound became, among the humans, the mechanic, which he found both accurate and slightly embarrassing. Among the Vrethkai, it became something he couldn't pronounce, a sonar designation he felt more than heard, a particular frequency that preceded him when he entered the vehicle bay, a kind of sonic label that said, "Small human, useful, handle with appropriate care." He didn't love being a label. He understood the value of it. The compound had 43 people in it, and James knew all of them within a month. There was Dr. Rollins, the station's colonial physician, a compact woman in her 40s who'd kept her medical kit through 3 searches by hiding it inside a piece of atmosphere processing equipment she'd convinced the Vrethkai was too delicate to disassemble. She had the calm of someone who'd made a decision about fear and just stopped having it, and she had decided, for reasons she never explained, to treat James as a project. She taught him biology in the evenings using the compound walls as a whiteboard. She made him learn the names of the muscles and bones in his hands. She said, "You'll need to understand what you're working with." There was Basie. Basie was not the kind of man who got compound designations. Basie was the kind of man who got through compound searches because he'd memorized the search schedule on day 2 and knew exactly when to hide the extra rations he'd accumulated through a trading operation that James took 3 weeks to fully map and another 3 weeks to respect. Basie was from somewhere in the outer colonies, spoke 5 languages and implied more, and had the particular quality of self-interest that somehow managed to seem like a personality trait rather than a moral failing. He looked at James with bright, assessing eyes and said, "You're the mechanic." "People keep calling me that," James said. "It's what you're worth to them." Basie let that sit. "What are you worth to yourself?" James thought about it. "I know the maintenance corridors. Everyone knows there are maintenance corridors. I know where they go." Basie looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled, and James felt the warmth of it and the danger of it in equal measure. Their arrangement was, like most arrangements in the compound, mutually exploitative and oddly affectionate. Basie provided supplemental rations and social cover, a grown human who could move through the compound's political landscape in ways a 12-year-old could not. James provided intelligence, patrol patterns, structural information. The ongoing translation project he'd been running in his head, connecting Vrethkai behavioral frequencies to probable intent. Basie called it the map. James called it survival. The months accumulated. He learned, in the way children in extreme circumstances sometimes learn, not gradually, but in sudden vertical drops of understanding, how to be alone without being lonely, how to be hungry without it being his only thought, how to sleep lightly in 3-hour cycles and wake up more rested than people who slept straight through the night. He learned to keep things. A piece of his mother's scarf he'd found trampled in the main concourse and had carried ever since. A page torn from the engineering magazine he'd taken from his bunk during the evacuation. The notebook with the maintenance map, its cover worn soft with handling. He could not remember what his parents looked like. This was the thing he hadn't told anyone. He could remember their presence, the specific warmth of his mother in a room, the particular texture of his father's silence. But the details of their faces had gone soft and indistinct the way faces do when you don't have photographs and you've been underground too long. He traced the outline of it sometimes at night, trying to hold the image still. It dissolved like smoke, he told Dr. Rollins one evening in October, sitting on the floor of her improvised medical bay while she reorganized her kit. He hadn't planned to tell her. The words arrived without announcement. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Memory isn't storage, it's reconstruction. You're not forgetting them. You're just rebuilding them every time from fewer materials." "What if I run out of materials?" She looked at him over her work. "That's why you're still carrying that scarf." He didn't say anything. She went back to her kit. Outside, the compound's boundary field hummed its steady low note, and a Vrethkai patrol walked its interval, and somewhere in the station above them a drive system cycled that James had tuned himself 3 weeks ago and recognized by the sound of it, the way you recognize a voice. He had been in the compound 11 months when the Kaidan attacked. He'd known it was coming. He hadn't known it was the Kaidan. That was a name he learned later, from a Vrethkai military officer who was too badly wounded to be careful about what he said. He'd known something was coming from the changes in the patrol frequencies. A tightening, a shortening of intervals, a quality of alertness in the sonar communications that felt different from routine vigilance. He'd filed it under threat response and waited to see what the threat was. When the attack came, it came fast. The Kaidan were a species James had never encountered and couldn't have imagined. Fluid form intelligences that traveled in swarms, each individual unit no larger than a human fist, capable of reconfiguring collectively into any shape required by the tactical situation. They came through the same jump corridor the Vrethkai had used to take Meridian, and they hit the Vrethkai positions like water hitting a wall. Not all at once, but finding every gap, every seam, pouring through in streams that reorganized into assault formations on the other side. In the compound, the humans stood at the boundary field and watched the sky through the cargo bay's upper viewports and didn't speak. Vrethkai ships burned against the station's hull. The swarms moved between them in patterns that looked, from a distance, like murmuration, like those flocks of starlings James had seen once in a video file, shifting and pivoting in perfect collective coordination, beautiful and incomprehensible. Nagata, the compound administrator, came to the compound himself during the second hour of the attack. James had never seen him in the compound before. He was smaller than the military cast, his ridge markings dimmer, but in the fluorescent wash of the bay lights he looked ancient and tired in a way that crossed species lines without difficulty. He looked, James thought, like a man whose job was over. Nagata stood at the boundary field and looked at the humans. The humans looked back. James stepped forward. It was not a decision he made consciously. Basie grabbed his arm. He felt the grip, firm and urgent, but he'd already taken the step, and now he was standing at the edge of the field, 2 meters from Nagata, and the administrator's ridge markings were cycling through something complex and unreadable. James raised his hand in the salute, the human gesture he'd taught himself from historical recordings, the flat-palmed straightening, the acknowledgement of presence. It felt ridiculous. He did it anyway. Nagata's ridge markings stilled. Then Nagata raised the equivalent appendage and returned it. It was a gesture. James knew it was just a gesture. But in the compound, among the humans, no one spoke for a full minute afterward, and Basie's grip on his arm loosened. and Dr. Rollins from behind him made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. The Kaiden took the station in 3 days. The Vrethkai left. They didn't surrender. They simply withdrew in the organized, unhurried way of a species that had been losing and surviving for a long time and knew how to treat a tactical retreat as a logistical problem rather than a catastrophe. They opened the compound boundary field on their way out. Nagata's logistics worker came to the vehicle bay where James was doing his morning inventory and set a Vrethkai calibration tool on the workbench without comment. Its ridge markings were dark. James picked up the tool and put it in his pocket. Then the compound was just an open cargo bay, and the humans were just 43 people standing in it. And outside, through the corridors and the maintenance passages, James knew better than anyone. The Kaiden were reorganizing their occupation of Meridian Station. Now what? Someone said. James was already at the maintenance panel. The Kaiden were different. The Vrethkai had been a system. The Kaiden were something else, something that James found, over the first 72 hours of their occupation, genuinely difficult to categorize. They didn't administer. They didn't process. They flowed through the station's spaces in small clusters, their individual units connecting and disconnecting from each other with an ease that looked, up close, less like coordination and more like thinking, as if the swarm was a single distributed mind working through a problem, and the humans were part of the problem. They didn't seem to know what to do with humans. This was, James realized, both dangerous and useful. The Vrethkai had known exactly what to do with humans, put them in a compound, assess their utility, allocate resources accordingly. The Kaiden had no such framework. They clustered around the humans and studied them with a focused attention that felt simultaneously like scientific interest and the attention of something that hasn't decided yet whether you're a threat or a resource or something to be moved out of the way. James spent the first week doing exactly what he'd done under the Vrethkai occupation, making himself useful, keeping his map updated, and watching. He watched the way the Kaiden moved through the station, not along the corridors, but through them, flowing around obstacles and people alike, their swarm forms shifting constantly. He watched the way they communicated, their individual units pulsing in rhythms that propagated through the swarm like ripples in water. He watched their reaction to humans, the slight compression of the swarm when someone moved unexpectedly, the way they tracked motion with a sensitivity that suggested either poor vision or extraordinary threat awareness. He was watching a cluster of them in the main junction of Ring 7 when he saw it. One of the cluster's units had separated from the main body and was moving in a tight spiral around one of the junction's lighting fixtures. The fixture had been malfunctioning. James had noted it on day 3, one of 24 station systems degrading without the Vrethkai maintenance schedule he'd been contributing to. The unit circled the fixture in a pattern that looked unmistakably like investigation. The unit pulsed. Nothing happened. It pulsed again, a different rhythm. Still nothing. James reached into his kit, found the correct calibration tool, the Vrethkai one Nagata's worker had left him, which happened to be compatible with the station's hybrid infrastructure, and walked toward the fixture. He moved slowly and deliberately. He felt the swarm's attention compress in his direction. He stopped, held up the tool so they could see it, then pointed at the fixture. The spiral unit stilled. James walked to the fixture and made the adjustment. The light came on steady. He stepped back. He looked at the unit. He didn't know what kind of acknowledgement Kaiden gave. He nodded, which felt both inadequate and distinctly human, and then he went on to his next maintenance stop. 3 hours later, a cluster of 4 Kaiden units met him at the entrance to Ring 8 and preceded him into the ring's maintenance corridor. Not blocking him, preceding him, walking, if that was the right word, with a quality that James, after some thought, filed under. Escort. Not prisoners, escort. Dr. Rollins found this more alarming than the compound had been. Vasey found it interesting in the specific way he found most things interesting. With the cold, speculative brightness of someone calculating angles, James found it clarifying. "They're not sure what you are," Rollins said, watching the cluster that had taken up a position near the medical bay's entrance. They hadn't entered. They seemed to have no interest in entering. They simply waited with the patient, recursive attention of entities for whom waiting didn't cost anything. "Nobody's sure what I am," James said. He was calibrating a secondary power coupling he'd been meaning to get to for 3 weeks. "I'm 12 and I fix things. You're also apparently the only person on this station that the Kaiden have decided to shadow." They shadow me because I go to the parts of the station they haven't mapped yet. Rollins looked at him. How do you know they haven't mapped it? Because they follow me instead of going ahead. He set down the coupling tool. If they knew where I was going, they'd be there already. They're following because they want to know where I'm going. The silence that followed had a particular quality, the quality of an adult reconsidering what category a child belongs in. James, Rollins said. I know, he said. I'm being careful. He was being careful. He was also, and this was something he didn't say aloud to Rollins, or to Basie, or to anyone, learning things. The maintenance work took him through the entire station on a rotating 7-day cycle, and the Kaiden escort meant he spent 7 to 12 hours a day in direct proximity to active swarm units. He watched their communication rhythms. He watched the way individual units responded differently to different stimuli, some seeming to carry what he could only describe as specialized functions. The way cells in a body carry specialized functions. He kept records in his engineering notebook, in a shorthand he'd invented because it was faster than standard notation, and because he was afraid someone would take the notebook if it looked too legible. By the end of the second month, he had a working model of Kaiden swarm communication. Not translation, he couldn't translate. He had pattern recognition. He knew which rhythm sequences preceded movement, which preceded what seemed like collective decision-making, which preceded the compression behavior he'd come to understand as alarm. He knew which rhythms the escort cluster produced when he did something unexpected versus something unfamiliar. He knew the difference between the swarm saying, "We don't know what this is," and the swarm saying, "This is a problem." He practiced in the privacy of his bunk, producing some of the simpler rhythms with his hands, tapping them on the wall, feeling how they sat in the air. He didn't know what he was going to do with any of this. He kept doing it. The crisis came on a night in what he'd come to think of as spring. Not a seasonal designation, just a point in the rotation cycle when the station's lighting algorithm shifted to longer intervals of warm spectrum, a Vrethkai approximation of a natural day length that the Kaiden had either preserved or simply not bothered to change. James was in Ring 4's secondary junction when he heard the alarm rhythm. Not a station alarm, a Kaiden rhythm, propagating through the corridor at a speed that meant it was being relayed through the entire swarm simultaneously, unit to unit like a shout traveling through a crowd. He stopped moving. The escort cluster around him had already changed formation, their units pulling in tight, their individual pulses synchronizing. Something was wrong. He ran. He ran toward the sound of it because he was 12 years old and had been in dangerous situations for 13 months and had learned, counterintuitively, that the direction of the danger was usually the direction where you had the most information. He ran through the junction and down the maintenance access corridor and up a ladder and through a crawl space he'd mapped on day 4 of the occupation and out through a ventilation panel into Ring 2's main corridor. The corridor was full of Kaiden, not the small maintenance clusters he'd been working alongside. The full swarm, or the majority of it, compressed into the corridor's length in a configuration he'd never seen, dense, layered. The individual units rotating slowly in a pattern that looked structural, like a wall made of water. They were between him and the far end of the corridor. At the far end of the corridor, through the swarm, James could see 30 or 40 humans, the humans from his compound, Rollins, Basie, the others. And between the humans and the swarm, something was happening that James couldn't quite parse at first. Some kind of back pressure, some pushing. The humans pressed against the far bulkhead in a way that looked less like a crowd at bay and more like a crowd being compacted. He understood. The Kaiden were making a decision. He walked into the swarm. He did it slowly, which was the right instinct. Sudden movement into an active swarm would produce alarm rhythms, would produce compression, would produce outcomes he didn't want. He walked in slowly, and the units parted for him the way they'd been parting for him for 2 months, making space without making a decision about it, because he was the maintenance human, and the maintenance human went where he needed to go. He walked until he was in the middle of it, units drifting around him, the alarm rhythm still propagating but quieter here, in the interior, like being in the eye of something. He stopped. He had one chance at this. He knew he had one chance. He'd had one chance at a lot of things this year, and had mostly, through luck and stubbornness and the maps he kept in his head, managed to take it. He put his hands out, palms up. The gesture meant nothing in Kaiden communication. That was fine. He hadn't meant it as a Kaiden gesture. Then he produced. with his left hand tapping against his right palm, the rhythm he'd spent 3 weeks learning. The one that the escort cluster produced when he did something they hadn't predicted but weren't alarmed by. The one he'd come to think of as, "Here is something you haven't seen before. It is not a threat." The propagation stopped. Not all at once, wave by wave, the alarm rhythm fading as his rhythm displaced it, or was passed alongside it, or changed what the swarm understood about the situation. He didn't know which. He kept tapping. He looked forward, toward the humans, and counted breaths. In the silence that followed, he heard very clearly someone in the crowd of humans cry. Just the one sound. Then nothing. The swarm's configuration changed. Units began to separate, to diffuse, to redistribute along the corridor walls. The compression at the far end released. He watched Rawlins's face, her expression moving through something he recognized as shock going through the process of becoming information, and Baisie's eyes finding him through the dispersing units, calculating, updating. He stood in the middle of the corridor until the swarm had fully redistributed. Then he walked to the humans. Nobody spoke for a while. Then Baisie said, quietly, "How did you do that?" "I've been paying attention," James said. He was 13. His voice was changing. He sounded, even to himself, older than he had in March. What followed was not peace, exactly. It was a negotiation, conducted in the broken pidgin of gestures and patterns and improvised symbols that James had been accumulating for months, with a swarm's intelligence that communicated in ways no human had ever systematically studied and that regarded him with a focused, patient interest that he chose to interpret as respect and might have been simply categorization. "It took 3 months, Doctor." Rawlins helped. She said, some training in non-human communication protocols from her medical residency, which James took to mean she was less afraid of the unfamiliar than most people. Baisie contributed the kind of strategic perspective that people who'd spent years navigating situations of uncertain advantage tended to develop. But mostly it was James and his notebook. The terms as they emerged, not a treaty, not exactly, more like an acknowledged arrangement, were simple. The humans would continue to maintain the station's infrastructure, which the Kaiden, as swarm intelligences without manipulative appendages or experience with built environments, had been struggling to manage. The Kaiden would recognize the human section of the station as a protected zone, and James would serve as what he could only describe as an interpreter, a human point of contact for a swarm that had, over 3 months of watching him work, arrived at the conclusion that humans were more useful than the Vrethkai had suggested. There was a moment, near the end of the 3rd month, that he came back to later. He'd been working on the station's primary communications array, the one that had been down since the Kaiden attack, the one that, if he got it running, would allow a signal to reach the Colonial Defense Network. The Kaiden knew what he was doing. They didn't stop him. He wasn't sure exactly what that meant. He had the panel open and was 3 hours into the repair when his hands found the broken splice he'd been looking for. He was lying on his back in the crawl space behind the array, the cold of the deck through his coverall, and he was humming. Had been humming for probably 20 minutes without noticing. The way you hum when you're working on something familiar, something your hands know how to do. Suo Gun, the old Welsh lullaby, the one he'd been singing when the world ended. He stopped humming. He lay in the dark and listened to the station around him. The drive systems he'd tuned, the climate processors he'd balanced, the lighting arrays he'd recalibrated to their seasonal cycles, and he thought about his parents' faces and found, for the first time in over a year, that he could hold the image. Not perfectly, not with the clarity of a photograph, but enough. The particular angle of his mother's smile, the way his father stood at a window, the materials were still there. He'd been rebuilding all along, in the dark, without knowing it. He made the splice. He heard the array come alive, with the frequency shift of a system cycling from cold to ready. He checked the signal range. He ran the diagnostic. He composed the message in the standard emergency format. Colonial designation, status, population count, duration of occupation, relevant intelligence about the occupying force. And then he paused with his finger over the transmit control. The Kaiden cluster outside the crawlspace was very still. He sent the signal. Nothing happened immediately. He hadn't expected it to. The Colonial Defense Network operated on a response cycle of weeks, sometimes months. He crawled out of the access panel and stood up, and the escort cluster regarded him with the steady, patient attention he'd come to find almost comfortable. He looked at them. "I did what I needed to do," he said. He wasn't sure why he said it. The words weren't translatable. but they needed to be said. The cluster pulsed once, slowly. He went back to work. The colonial defense ships arrived 53 days later. 3 of them, dropping out of the jump corridor above Meridian in the middle of what the station's lighting algorithm called morning. And the first James knew of it was the distant percussion of their weapon systems engaging the Kaidan perimeter defense. He ran to the observation deck. The battle, viewed from the cargo bay's upper viewports, was extraordinary, a quality of light he'd never seen. The colonial ships' pulse weapons leaving afterimages against the dark, the Kaidan swarms reorganizing in response in their fluid, impossible formations. He stood at the viewport with his hands on the cold plexi and watched it the way he'd watched everything this year, with total attention, mapping what he saw, filing it, trying to understand. Behind him, he heard people running. He heard Basie's voice, calculating odds. He heard Rollins organizing the compound's medical supplies in anticipation of casualties. He didn't move from the viewport. There was a point, an hour into the engagement, when one of the colonial ships took a critical hit to its drive system and began to drift toward the station's hull. Slowly at first, then faster, a mass of several thousand tons acquiring momentum in a way that would end with significant structural damage to Ring 3, where the medical bay was, where 20 of the compound's 43 people currently were. James was already moving before the calculation finished. He went through the maintenance corridor at a run, down 3 ladders, through the junction he'd used 100 times, into the drive system's ancillary room, where the station's emergency attitude thrusters, original equipment from Meridian's construction, rarely tested, technically the property of whoever was currently occupying the station, sat in a state of standby readiness that James had confirmed 7 months ago and quietly maintained ever since, because that was what you did with systems that might matter. You kept them ready. He fired the nearest thruster cluster at 40% output. The station moved. Not far. 300 meters of lateral displacement, relative to the drifting colonial ship. Enough to change the impact geometry from catastrophic to navigable. Enough that the ship's own maneuvering system, which clearly still had some function, could take over and correct. He watched the numbers on the thruster display with the specific, quiet intensity of someone who has made a decision and needs to know whether it was right. The ship corrected. It came to rest against the station's outer docking ring with a contact he felt through the deck. A solid, metallic thud that traveled through Meridian's bones and up through the soles of his boots and into his hands, still resting on the thruster controls. He was breathing very hard. He stood there for a moment, just breathing, and then he put the thrusters back on standby and went to find his notebook. The colonial forces secured the station over the following 18 hours. James spent most of that time in the maintenance corridors, partly because it was where he was most useful, partly because large groups of armed adults moving through spaces he'd spent a year learning to navigate silently felt strange in a way he couldn't articulate. He encountered a colonial marine in Ring 5 who pointed a weapon at him before taking in the coveralls, the toolkit, the worn notebook tucked under one arm, and said, "You're a kid." "I'm the maintenance engineer," James said. The marine looked at him for another moment. Then she lowered the weapon. He found Rollins and Basie in the compound, where the colonial forces had directed the human survivors while the station was cleared. Basie was talking to a colonial intelligence officer with the easy fluency of someone who had several conversations ready and was selecting among them. Rollins was treating a marine's shoulder wound with the calm efficiency of someone for whom emergency medicine was simply medicine. James sat on the floor in the corner of the cargo bay. His corner, the one he'd had since month 1. The one near the heating duct, and opened his notebook. He updated the maintenance log. He noted the thruster use and the fuel expenditure, and flagged the system for inspection before next use. He wrote in the margin in his cramped personal shorthand, "Kaidan swarm dispersed. Communication protocols, see attached. Colonial forces arrived day 423. He wrote array repaired. He wrote signal sent. He wrote finally, after staring at the blank margin for a long time, still here. They found his parents 6 weeks later. They were on a refugees transport that had been redirected 3 times due to the conflict, and they came through Meridian's docking ring on a Tuesday morning. It was always a Tuesday, he thought, in his life, that things ended and began, and his mother walked through the lock and stopped when she saw him, and made a sound he'd been afraid, for over a year, he would never hear again. He had grown 4 centimeters. He was sun-browned from the warm spectrum lighting algorithm he'd tweaked in month 8. He had a Vrethkai calibration tool in his pocket and a year of notebooks in his kit, and a knowledge of swarm communication patterns that the Colonial Intelligence Service had, over the past 6 weeks, been gently but persistently asking him about. His father stood behind his mother and looked at him with an expression James had never seen on him before. Something that had to do with understanding arriving too late, and also with something more complicated, something that looked like reckoning. James walked toward them. He felt the distance close. His mother's arms around him were the same temperature they'd always been, the same specific warmth. He'd been rebuilding the memory from fewer and fewer materials. The original, it turned out, was still available. He held on. Outside, Meridian Station breathed around them. The drive systems, the climate processors, the lighting arrays, the communications array, transmitting on a clear signal to a network that knew, now, this station's name. The systems James Calloway had kept alive through a year of occupation, in 2 of them, working from a map he'd drawn in his own head. He was 13 years old. He had calluses on his hands, and a Vrethkai salute in his muscle memory, and the patterns of an alien swarm mind notated in a shorthand no one else could read. He had, against all reasonable expectation, held the line, not with weapons, not with an army at his back, with a map, with a calibration tool, with the specific human tendency, the one that looked, from outside, like stubbornness and felt, from inside, like being unable to stop paying attention. With a lullaby he'd been singing when the world ended and hadn't been able to stop since.